Hello, my name is Emil Marmol. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. My good friend and colleague Alpesh Masuria at the University of East London has asked me to address three broad themes here in Cuba. The first is solidarity. The second is social entitlements and welfare provision. The third will be education. I've added two more because I think they'll be of great interest. The fourth will be internationalist solidarity, and the fifth will be sustainable development. Solidarity in Cuba. Solidarity is one of the foundational principles of the Cuban Revolution. Solidarity in Cuba manifests itself both externally and internally. Externally, the Cuban government demonstrates its solidarity by providing doctors, educators, engineers, and specialized technicians when needed by other countries. At present, there are tens of thousands of Cubans working abroad in various capacities. Recently, Cuba was pivotal in the containment of Ebola in West Africa. The contingent that traveled to West Africa received the Dr. Lee Jong-wook Memorial Prize, an international award for public health given by the World Health Organization. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Cuba offered to send personnel to the US, an offer which was rejected by the US government. These aforementioned services were provided free of cost to foreign countries until the collapse of the Soviet Union, which precipitated the Periodo Especial, or special period, a time of severe economic difficulty for the Cuban people. Since the special period, the Cuban government has instituted a variety of payment plans for foreign countries, ranging from full payment to cost splitting to no payment at all, depending upon the host nation's ability to pay. Those Cubans who work abroad receive a salary in their host nation. In addition to this, their Cuban salary continues to be paid and is collected by their family in Cuba for their own use. A factor that has hampered Cuban humanitarian relief efforts abroad was a US policy discontinued by Obama that allowed Cubans in any foreign country to simply walk onto a US embassy and declare they wished to move to the US. In this way, Cuba was being robbed of its best and brightest, and at the same time, the US was sabotaging the good work being done by Cuban doctors abroad. Cuba has also offered moral and military support to a number of liberation movements abroad, including countries such as Vietnam, Angola, the Congo, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and was instrumental in the elimination of apartheid in South Africa. Internally, solidarity is something that can be said to be an inherent trait that is transmitted culturally in Cuba. Latin culture is characterized by relationality, which emphasizes mutual help, interdependence, and group process over autonomous action, as well as by the closely related concept of allocentrism, which involves defining one's self-concept in relation to others, emphasizing interdependence. Cuban people, including myself, are told from a very early age to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and to cause no harm to others. Instilled in us is the idea that we must help and share our resources with our fellow brothers and sisters, or comrades, if you will. The government helps to inculcate ideas of solidarity by transmitting them through the media. Radio and TV regularly air public service announcements geared towards solidarity with the disabled, the elderly, and recently, the gay community. There are TV programs dedicated to the prevention of domestic violence. These public service announcements shed a positive light on those individuals who help others that are less fortunate. Perhaps the greatest act of solidarity within Cuba was the literacy campaign. The literacy rate prior to the Cuban Revolution was below 70%. Immediately following the revolution, a literacy campaign was established which helped bring the literacy rate to 96% within 2 years. This literacy campaign helped to bring people together to work towards the common goal of educating the community. The Cuban literacy campaign has been exported to numerous countries around the world where it has been used to help millions to learn to read and write. It is a model to emulate. Even wealthy nations such as New Zealand have adopted its use. A final factor that has helped foster solidarity among the Cuban people is their abhorrence of the US blockade. Cubans have suffered greatly due to the economic effects of the blockade, as well as from acts of sabotage and terrorism emanating from the US. The Cuban population has had to work together to overcome the challenges posed by their historically hostile neighbor to the north. Social entitlements and welfare provision. The Cuban government favors and offers support to individual and cooperative initiatives to build homes. It nevertheless plays a central role in home construction. Despite government efforts, the number of housing units being built in the country is far from meeting the accumulated demand. There is a deficit in the housing sector due to decades of ongoing challenges, including the impact of hurricanes, aging of buildings, population increases, and the effects of the US blockade. The housing situation has worsened in Cuba, particularly in some areas such as Old Havana, Cerro, and Centro Havana. Because old buildings collapse or they're in such bad condition that for safety reasons, families are moved to temporary facilities. In an effort to resolve these problems and to prevent homelessness in the country, the Cuban government has created shelters and other temporary housing facilities. These facilities are similar to cooperative housing models that exist in some communities around the world. The actions of the Cuban government have provided suitable living conditions for the population and have very nearly eliminated homelessness across the country. In Cuba, one does not see anywhere near the level of homelessness present in other countries, including wealthy nations such as the US or UK. In spite of great efforts made by the Cuban government, there are some, albeit very few, homeless people. This is a situation that did not exist before the special period, or periodo especial. For those people that live in the streets, the Cuban government has created a national program for the so-called deambulantes that exist in the country. For these people, there are shelters where they are taken for free by bus. Once there, they are provided with a decent place to sleep, bedding, food, specialized medical treatment, which can include psychiatric care and substance abuse counseling, and care of their personal appearance, including having their hair and nails trimmed. They are given soap, toothpaste, a toothbrush, clothing, and other benefits free of charge. Family solidarity, a value inherent to Cuban culture and encouraged by the government through education and media, facilitates several generations cohabitating harmoniously in the same home. Extended families living together helps to assuage the shortage of housing. 85% of Cubans own their own homes mortgage-free. Cubans are limited to the ownership of one residence, or one primary residence, and one vacation residence. A capitalist might take the view that this is a limit on their freedom. However, limiting the number of homes that one individual may own prevents the concentration of wealth and price speculation that are among the root causes of poverty and homelessness in so many capitalist countries. In Cuba, housing is a right, not a commodity. It can be concluded that homelessness is not a problem due to remediation efforts and actions taken by the Cuban government and familial solidarity. Hunger and abject poverty simply do not exist in Cuba. No one goes to bed hungry in Cuba is a common saying among the people here. In spite of the fact that families expend most of their money on food, there is no hunger in Cuba. Every Cuban citizen is given a subsidized ration of food every month, which helps to provide for basic nutritional needs. This helps to explain why Cuba has the lowest malnutrition rate of any country in Latin America. Retired people can eat at a very low cost in places created for them called Sistema de Atención a la Familia, or family care system. Lunch and dinner is provided to them so that they can eat at least 2 meals a day at an affordable price. I'm here at the University of Havana, where I'll be speaking about education in Cuba. Education is completely free in Cuba, from primary school to graduate school. One can study for their entire lives if they so choose, and attain multiple academic, professional, technical, and trade degrees. Books and materials are supplied for free. There are no costs. The only requirement is that those who complete a bachelor's degree then go on to complete 2 years of public service in which they provide expertise in their field to the local region in Cuba in which that expertise is most needed. Education isn't simply free in Cuba. It is considered a basic human right and is universally accessible. In rural areas, for instance, boarding schools have been built so that all have the ability to attend. In the event that a boarding school is not within reach, the government will hire someone in the area with previous teacher education training to teach pupils located in these remote areas. If there are no teachers in the area, the government will train the parents of the child so that they can provide education to their children themselves. This training is not only free, but the parents are paid for this service. These rural schools are provided with solar panels to power the TV and computer that is provided by the government for the educational needs of the students. There are specialized schools set up all over the country to assist in the education of students with special needs. These include schools for those that are visually and hearing impaired, the physically incapacitated, as well as those with autism and Down syndrome. These schools did not exist previous to the revolution. Cuban education upholds the values of the revolution. Students are taught the principles of socialism, the importance of providing for the public good, and solidarity in the community. Individualism and self-interest are discouraged, and in their place, students are taught instead to work together and cooperate towards common goals. Students are not only assessed with individual marks, but are also assessed comprehensively as a class. All academic subjects are geared and purposed towards the betterment of society. In the Cuban education system, there is a strong emphasis on Cuban history. Students wishing to study at university must pass 3 entrance exams, which consist of Spanish, math, and history. It is felt that students must have a comprehensive grasp of Cuba's past in order to forge a future path. Part of this deep understanding is that of their colonial past, including the conditions on the island, both under Spanish and US rule. This includes the hardships faced by the Cuban population due to decades under embargo, and acts of sabotage and terrorism committed and/or organized by the United States. Internationalist solidarity. Something that I find absolutely astounding about Cuba is that it provides more humanitarian relief, medical care, and training for foreign nations than the sum of the G7 nations combined. Just let that sink in for a second. Cuba has a GDP that is a mere fraction of any of the G7 nations, yet it provides more assistance than the entire G7 put together. This is an exceptional achievement. There are about 40,000 health professionals working in 72 countries, and over 130,000 Cuban doctors have volunteered abroad since 1963. Not only does Cuba provide more assistance abroad than any other nation, the manner in which it has carried out this work is unlike anything practiced by wealthy nations or NGOs. Cuba sends medical personnel to the afflicted country in need and provides help while simultaneously giving scholarships to members of impoverished or marginalized people from that country who would otherwise be unable to afford medical school, so that they can travel to Cuba to study to become doctors. Those people who've been trained in Cuba then return to their home country to continue to assist their communities and to provide medical training. Instead of a mere band-aid, Cuba provides long-term solutions. Much of this medical training occurs at LM in Havana, the world's largest medical university. According to data provided by John Kirk in the Journal of Diplomacy and Statecraft, as of March 2008, there were 8,234 students from 28 countries, including 105 visible minority US students, attending LM. 5,962 medical students have graduated, most of whom have returned to their country of origin, while many have stayed in Cuba for further specialization. Cuba has established medical schools in Yemen, Ethiopia, Uganda, Ghana, Gambia, Equatorial Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau, among others. Some examples of Cuban internationalist solidarity include the US, where Cuba offered to send 1,586 doctors to assist with Hurricane Katrina. The offer was denied because the US placed politics before the lives of some of its most marginalized and poor communities. Pakistan, where after a major earthquake that killed 73,000 people, the Cuban government sent 2,500 medical staff and set up 30 field hospitals that were later donated to local communities. In recent years, Cuba has sent 688 medical staff to Guatemala, 602 to Bolivia, 135 to Indonesia, and smaller groups to China, Peru, and Mexico after major disasters in those countries. Through Operation Miracle, 1.31 million patients from 33 countries have received eye surgery at no cost. 33,000 of these surgeries have been performed in Cuba at no cost. There are around 30,000 Cuban medical staff working in Venezuela. Cuba has helped to open 6,000 clinics, 388 polyclinics, and 492 rehabilitation centers there. Cuba opened its doors to those affected by the catastrophic nuclear explosion in Chernobyl in 1988. To this day, 24,000 Ukrainians and Belarusians have been treated for radiation illnesses in Cuba. Cuba has helped to increase quality of life indices, such as maternal and infant mortality rates in those countries in which it has provided assistance. To quote John Kirk, "No nation on the planet has done so much in terms of saving lives through medical intervention." It should be mentioned that medical care within Cuba is exceptional and can be compared favorably with much wealthier nations. In 2015, Cuba became the first country in the world to receive validation from the World Health Organization that it had eliminated mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis. In Cuba, Zika is virtually non-existent. Life expectancy in Cuba is among the highest in the world, higher than the US, for example. After everything I've learned about Cuban internationalist solidarity, the saying, "another world is possible," is something that has taken on a new and revived significance for me. If Cuba can help to foster so much good in the world with so little material wealth, then surely the world's wealthiest countries can do much, much more. The arguments made by the ruling elite that there just isn't enough money to go around, or that the wealth will eventually trickle down, is nonsense. The problem is that capitalist priorities are skewed and are a perversion of the principles of mutual aid inherent in humans. We could in fact live in an entirely different, more just and humane world. It simply requires a different form of political and economic societal organization. I want to end by giving credit to John Kirk's article, Cuban Medical Internationalism and its Role in Cuban Foreign Policy, from which many of the facts and figures in this segment were garnered and/or directly quoted. The high degree of sustainable development in Cuba is testament to the political will and actions taken by the Cuban government to protect the environment and the model of society that has been created in the country. The vision for sustainable development in Cuba is particular in that it is human-centered. Another distinct aspect of the conceptualization and day-to-day application of sustainable development in the Caribbean island is equity as an essential part of development and social justice. Cuba has received a significant amount of praise, both by the media and international organizations, for the sustainable practices adopted by the country over the last few decades. For instance, in 2006, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature declared Cuba the only country to have achieved sustainable development. Cuba often tops lists of sustainable or green countries. According to Yale and Columbia universities, the most sustainable countries in the world in 2012 were Iceland, Switzerland, Costa Rica, Sweden, Norway, Mauritius, France, Austria, Cuba, and Colombia. Cuba ranks 12th out of 151 countries in the Happy Planet Index, which measures experienced well-being in terms of life expectancy and ecological footprint. Cuba's success is the result of a combination of government policies adopted since 1959 and its responses to the circumstances of the 1990s, when Cuba's economy was severely impacted by the fall of the Soviet Union and the ensuing collapse of the Eastern Bloc of socialist countries, which marked the end of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. Cuba has had a number of successful policy responses to deal with the economic crisis, culminating in the 2006 energy revolution. The island nation has been remarkably successful at revitalizing its energy sector over the last 2 decades, significantly increasing efficiency and reducing energy intensity and emissions. In terms of energy intensity, in 1971, the Cuban economy needed 4.3 barrels of oil equivalent, while in 2012 it needed only 1.5 barrels of oil equivalent to produce the same amount of GDP. Between 2006 and 2013, Cuba's GDP increased 41%, while fuel consumption decreased by 6%. This can be partly explained by Cuba's decentralized power production and distribution system, which helps to eliminate the loss of power that comes with long-distance transmission. Recent data of CO2 emissions support the argument that emission levels have been decreased over the same time frame. According to the journalist Craig Watson, there is little argument that Cuba is home to the most valuable demonstration of chemical-free farming in the world. Watson expressed that the wide-scale adoption of organic farming methods that has been field-tested in Cuba since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 has demonstrated to the rest of the world the efficacy and economic viability of this model. Cuba's reality of the 1990s reinforced earlier environmental policies undertaken by the government and led to new practices and policies that brought about what many would consider to be sustainable outcomes. According to Arrastilla and Glidden, one key component of the energy revolution is a deepening concern and respect for the environment. They mentioned some indicators of a cultural shift in the state's decision-making, particularly cancellation in the 1990s of 2 large power projects because of environmental concerns. The first was a peat mining project in the Zapata Swamp, Ciénaga de Zapata, a wetland considered a Ramsar site, International Agreement for Wetlands Protection. The second would have been a 360 megawatt hydroelectric project on the Tajo-Tabajo rivers in the Alejandro de Humboldt National Park. Both projects would have helped the country to meet energy demands during the worst years of the 1990s, but political will towards environmental protection impeded their construction. According to official data from the National Offices of Statistics, since 1986, Cuba's protected areas have grown by 70%, from 17,154 square kilometers to 29,169 square kilometers, including land and water protected areas. One of the most important ecological problems of Cuba have been deforestation. It is said that when Christopher Columbus arrived in the late 15th century, At least 90% of the island was covered by woodlands. When the revolutionary forces defeated Batista's dictatorship in 1959, only 14% of the national territory was covered by forests. In 2015, the area covered by forests was 30.6%, a remarkable increase of more than 30% since the beginning of the revolution.